Let's get to another caller here. I want to talk to Johnny, who's calling in from Texas. Johnny, you're live on Truth Wanted. What's up?
Hey, guys. Thanks for taking my call.
Thanks.
Big fan of both of y'all. I want to echo what Justin said. Y'all are both very instrumental in my, development, my understanding of epistemology and how to evaluate claims. And I was very into conspiracy thinking and, the New World Order and Illuminati and all that shit. And that really had a hold on me for a lot of years. So I appreciate both of y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you.
Glad it was useful.
So, yeah. So my question is, I recently, I'm really into SE. I actually called the show a couple months ago and asked a question about SE. I can't remember what it was, but I like that style of conversation. I feel like it's easy to progress the conversation with that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I recently had a really good conversation with both my parents, kind of in the same boat as Justin, where, they both believed, they both do believe. And, every now and then we'll be talking about, my dad's real into science and we both really like astronomy. And so we share, new things that we've learned about astronomy. And every now and then, he'll make a little side statement like, oh, isn't it so great that it just feels like it's so amazing that it, how could it all have happened by accident? Or, feels like there's a designer kind of thing, And anyway, so we had a really good conversation that came out of him making one of those comments. And ultimately his position is, I kind of kept pressing him on it, and he basically said, wherever, like, we can continue to understand everything, right? We can discover more and more about the universe and its beginnings and its workings and all that stuff, but there's always going to be a limit, and behind that limit, that's where God is, right?
Mm.
And so I kind of wanted to get both of y'all's thoughts on how to progress the conversation from there, how to press him a little bit more, because he was kind of but, he kind of explained that he believed in a sort of a deistic type of, universe starter, and then sat back and doesn't interfere.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And so I kind of got stuck with, didn't really know what to ask him, because they both believe in the Christian God. And that was kind of where the conversation ended. We've been talking for 4 or 5 hours,
Yeah. This kind of a talk. Yeah, this idea of God is it's interesting to me because this was kind of my idea of God for a while. In fact, if you go to my conversation with Anthony, I kind of talk about God sort of in this language. And a description of this is like the non-overlapping magisteria, which is kind of this idea that there is science and then there's religion, and you can kind of put a dividing line between the two. And there's just some things that science can answer and some things about God and religion that just can't be answered by science or can't be explained, by a human understanding, human logic. There's different ways to explain that. But like at the end of the day, if we're talking about God and we're using like the language of logic, if we're saying, oh, this has to be the intent of God, or this is the design of God, then there is a kind of rationality being used there, or there is a kind of observation that's being used there. And that's why this kind of, logic about God doesn't really make sense, because we are ultimately talking about God within a framework of human understanding. Clearly, he's not beyond human understanding. If we're able to attribute certain things about God, there must be some things about God, or at least his work, that we can know about him. So in that sense, it doesn't make sense. And I know that you know that, but it's good to kind of, parse that out a bit. So, but as far as questions I would ask, I would just say, well, if God is beyond our understanding, then how do we know anything about him? Or how do you know that that's his work? Or
I literally just typed, if God begins at the limits of human understanding, how does he understand this?
Yeah.
I mean, he's basically claiming to detect the undetectable, to understand that which cannot be understood. And it's just a fallacy to say that God begins where we don't understand things. That's called God of the gaps.
And that's what I tried to explain. But I think he would just readily admit we can't understand it, right? And his, you know, he tried to equate my position of saying, you know, I base my beliefs on the evidence and I don't go any further than our current knowledge justifies us going. I don't posit, you know, I don't take that extra step and posit, oh, God is responsible for this, right? But you do. Sure. And I'm wondering why you do that. And he's basically saying, well, your position of saying I don't know is equal to my position of saying I think he's there. And I'm like,
is it?
No, I'm trying to explain, you know, yeah. And I'm like, no, it's actually not. And then I try and, you know, I'm like, here's why, because, you know, X, Y, and Z, and it was just like a brick wall, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's this is the kind of God that goes like, it's what happens when we live in an increasingly kind of postmodern world and we have more postmodern ideas about God, you know, not that I'm ragging on postmodernism, but just saying as a culture, how we understand religion. Yeah. Well, there's different thoughts there about that, but like, you know, as and talking about the God concept, right? Like it's easier, you know, like the atheist community sometimes is criticized because we talk a lot about fundamentalism and fundamentalist ideas of God. And it's true that there are a lot of Christians who don't really have that idea of God. But the problem is when you talk about these other ideas of God, when it becomes, you know, more and more outside of like the realm of falsifiability, then it just becomes a conversation of like, well, how do we really know anything about this God? You know, and it's a conversation that ultimately goes nowhere. We have all of these assumptions about God and his intentions and his place in the world and his purpose for our lives that we could never possibly demonstrate just based on our own definition of God, that being something that's completely unknowable. So I share your frustration, and the only advice I could suggest is just asking like how they know things about God, how they know about God's intentions in the world, and if, you know, if they grew up in a different part of the world, and would they understand God differently? Is it possible that their experiences shape what they know about God? And if their personal experiences shape what they know about God, then what does that say about knowing God in general, right? Like I will hear Christians who will say that God is outside of what we can know, and at the same time tell me stories where they've either personally talked to God or God has done something in their lives. So God is working in the physical world. He's doing stuff for us. And again, that's just, you know, it becomes this weird idea about God that we just can't do anything with unless all we can do is kind of ask questions about it. Right. So anyway, Matt, do you have any more thoughts?
Matt said it's a very nebulous. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, no, the one thing that stuck out is that, so he says that his position of thinking there is a God out there beyond all of this is equivalent to your saying you don't know. And I would actually just draw that out in a chart, because if the question is there a thinking agent that exists beyond our comprehension? And your answer is, I don't know. And your dad's answer is, I believe there is. Then what's the reason for that? Those aren't the same answer.
Yeah.
And if his answer is just, well, it's just the same as I don't know, then what he's really saying is he doesn't know, but he hopes.
Yeah.
And hope is different from I have a good reason to believe this, or I am convinced. So
yeah. And you can play with this too. You know, I hear a lot of people say that God is, I was just going to say, you hear a lot of people say, well, God is love, right? And that's an interesting one. Maybe your dad would agree with that. And I'd like to posit, well, what if I think God is hate? How would you demonstrate that to be wrong?
Yeah.
I could show you lots of reasons why I could think God is actually hate and not love. And then, you know, maybe that's a good example where you can go down where, you know, using vague adjectives isn't the best way to make claims about God. But anyway, hopefully that was helpful, Johnny. Any last shout outs before we let you go?
No, that's it, man. I was actually super happy. The timing worked out when I called in, just so that I could call in, and then I found out that Matt was the guest. So that's really cool to hear both you guys, you know, helping me out with this and your thoughts on it, and just keep doing what you're doing, and you're making a big difference.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you,
Johnny. I appreciate it.
Have a good one. Everybody, this is why I like using the atheist label now, Matt. It's like I don't know what God is anymore. God is just anything. I don't think there's a more nebulous word in the English language than God. I really don't think there is. Maybe love. But
the problem with igtheism, which is and theistic non-cognitive, or
you got it.
Yeah, all right. Is this essentially? It holds that the question itself is meaningless. Well, that's not true. I mean, that's just demonstrably not true. Theological non-cognitivism, this notion that what's true is that there are many different God claims. But if I said, do you believe in Fergal, Burgle, Menergal, you could have an igtheism position on, or an agnostic position on, or a non-cognitive position on, because that's a name that I made up, which has no context. I specifically made it up for that purpose, although now it's taken on a life of its own and people want Fergal, Burgle, Menergal t-shirts.
Right.
The truth is that while there are many different God concepts, they are not nonsense and they are not devoid. It's just that this person's God is different from this person's God, is different from this person's God. But in each of them, they're positing a thing that they can describe, which means it's not meaningless. What it is devoid of substance or support.
Yes.
And I don't get too bent out of shape about agnosticism.
No, I gotcha.
Cognitive.
I think that's a good point to think. When I use the term, it's more of a statement, more of a political statement than it is a philosophical belief. It's more of me saying I can't make a blanket statement about God because I don't know what your God is.
Right.
So until you can define that God for me, that's how I use that term.
That is absolutely the right thing. And that's one of the reasons why you and I have a slightly different perspective on this than some people, which is if somebody came up to me on the street and said, hey, do you believe in God? I'd say no. But they'd say, you don't know which God I'm talking about. And my answer is, it doesn't matter. I don't believe in any of them. And so if you tell me that your God is this cup of iced tea, okay, well, I now believe that this cup of iced tea exists. I don't know what your justification is for calling it God. And the fact that we can have that conversation means there's some, even if it's ill-defined, minimal baggage that the God label contains. Because if somebody came up to you and said, this cup of iced tea is Fergal Burgle, you'd be like, that makes no sense. But if they said this is God, you have some concept because there's some minimal concept within the vast human experience.
Because there are people that have talked to me and say, well, I think God is the universe, or I think God is love. It's like, okay, well, I think the universe exists. So
I believe in the universe and I believe in love.
I'll let the God claim come up. But to me, I also like the atheist label because it makes people have to look that up usually. And so I'd rather them go look it up so I don't have to explain things. So
that's a fair point.
But anyway, I want to give a quick shout out. Somebody in the chat donated $1,000 anonymously to Truth Wanted. I don't think we've ever gotten a donation that high on this show. So thank you. Whoever just donated $1,000 in the chat. You guys are awesome. I really do appreciate that.
That is outstanding. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And all that money, again, it goes towards Truth Wanted and goes towards all ACA projects, particularly, but it helps show people on the board and people who make these shows happen that, hey, Truth Wanted is a show that's worth supporting. So thank you guys so much for doing that.